Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is the evening of April 20th, although you're probably watching this more like the 21st or sometime after. There's our three questions, A, B, and C for this week. Let me switch the view of the camera here for a moment. Sorry about the shakiness. There we go. And there we are. All right. How you doing, folks? I hope you're well. I got to tell you, I miss teaching. I know this substitutes as teaching, but the environment of a classroom, getting in there, throwing material, having a laugh, answering questions, I miss that. And I am sure that you miss many things in this world, and I do too. But it is at times like this when we have to communicate in this way that I miss teaching. So I hope you're well. Sincerely, I hope you're making it through this corona crisis as best as possible and getting on, and hopefully at some point in the near future we can come back together to normalcy as best as possible. All right, tonight's topic is manifest destiny, which is a very American topic. But before we go there, let's talk housekeeping. Obviously, I just showed you the questions. Those are the ones due next week, right? If you look at the span of things, we only have 2 more weeks of material to go. We have a week of the 1850s where we're going to talk about kind of the build up to the election of Abraham Lincoln, and then the Civil War follows upon that. So we're getting down to the end here. If you've been turning in your work, great. If you haven't, please do. Those of you who have turned it in this week, you'll notice that when I'm grading it, I'm giving you an overall total. Now, there may be a question that you want to ask that you don't want to ask because you want to seem really polite, and I appreciate it, but let's talk about it right here. You're thinking to yourself, wait a moment, Holiday just sent me my score, and now, does that mean I'm kind of done doing work? That's possible, okay? I started out at the beginning of the course, you'll remember, saying that if you did well early on, you could miss the last test. And when we transferred over to the quarantine schedule, I wanted to make sure that I acknowledged people who had continued to do well, had started well, stayed on that track, and wanted to make sure that they were rewarded for that effort. So, in essence, remember that this is a 1,000-point class. At the moment where you get to 900 points, I'm not saying that you have to stop working. I'm not saying you should stop working. In fact, I'd love it if you kept watching the videos. I would hope that you would continue to do that. But as far as turning in assignments, when you get to 900 points, you've achieved the A that you can get in the course. Okay, or 800 for a B, or 700 for a C. So my point being that if you're sitting there thinking, I wonder what happens if I don't turn in the last 2 assignments. Well, if you're over 900 points, then it's still an A, and no hard feelings. Please don't sit here thinking that I am going to be like, ooh, that guy didn't turn in those last 2 assignments. Absolutely not. You earned the opportunity to not do them. If we were still in a classroom environment, I would probably sit down to the last exam of the year, and there would be people who didn't show up because they didn't have to. So let's try and honor what we started with as best as possible there. All right? If you have questions about that, if you're unclear about it, hit me up. I'm happy to clarify it. Okay, we'll put the questions away for the moment. I have my slides in front of me here. I also have them here. If you do not have the slides near you this week, you may want to. There's a couple of maps we need to have a fairly careful look at. So if you have the opportunity to somehow bring them up on another screen, or if you can print them, that's good. This is going to sound really bad, but the color on the map makes a difference too. Thanks, Holiday. I really have a color printer. I know. I'm not trying to be a pain in the neck, but being able to see the different colors on this map on slide number 27 and again on 29 going to make a difference for us. So if you can do that, it's going to help in your comprehension of the unit. All right? Pardon me, a little sip of tea. Let's roll. Okay, manifest destiny. I said at the outset that this is a very American topic. Let me try and flesh out what I mean by that. We have spent the last few weeks talking about an America divided in various ways. Let's run through that. We talked about antebellum sectionalism, stumbled through that, where we talked about these regional economies, the manufacturing hub of the Northeast, where they made textiles, or the slave-dependent cotton-heavy South, okay, or the West, where they made a lot of farm products. And we talked about how that divided the nation. In the next week after that, we talked about the sharp political divide between the Jacksonian Democrats and the Whig Party that rose to challenge them. Last week, we added to that the cultural divide of the Second Great Awakening. the reform movements attempting to change America. And obviously, there are going to be those people who would say, I don't see any need for change. We're exactly the way we need to be. And that is going to lead to a cultural divide across the United States. So my point is this, that when we pick up the ball here in the 1830s or 40s to talk about Manifest Destiny, it's been a last few weeks of discord and clash, and Americans are divided politically, economically, culturally. This is a topic, though, that pretty well puts those divisions to rest, at least on this topic. Americans want to inhabit the western portion of North America. Manifest Destiny is this notion that we, and we alone, have been chosen by God for the specific task of the conquest and the taking of the territories of the western portion of North America. Americans believe that the economic opportunities there are important, but on top of that, that we have a cultural obligation to bring with us our Republican forms of government, our religious ideals. All of it comes with us as we go west. And it really is, think of it this way, it's the continuation of day one. 1607, the first person showed up in Jamestown, and Americans have been pushing west ever since. And this is us fulfilling that destiny, that mission that we have. What's out there, Holiday? Well, at this point, the major industries of the far west are things like cattle. There's a pretty solid trade going on with Asia at this point, China especially. Americans are beginning to get into the lumber and the railroad industries in the West. Now, there isn't gold yet. That's going to come a little bit later on today when gold is struck. But until then, Americans believed this was still a wonderful territory. Now, let's be fair. Is it uninhabited? No, it isn't uninhabited. There are plenty of people to be had there. If we're talking about the southwestern portion of the United States, well, that's Mexico. Newly independent Mexico gained their freedom and their independence from the Spanish. That is not obviously open territory. If we go towards the northwest, it's a little more muddled. You've got claims there. In other words, there's so few Europeans that there isn't enough of a presence of any one European country, or the United States for that matter, to say this is definitely ours. So you've got claims by the British and the French. You've got claims by the United States. Russia's in there, and you're thinking, Russia? Remember, Russia owns Alaska at this point. So owning the Pacific Northwest, I know we might think of the Russians as the other side of the world, but that wraps around. It's not that far from there for the Russians. Okay, so there's a lot of claims there. Now, on top of that, you've got Native American tribes living there too, who have their own claims. And unfortunately, those are generally, I beg your pardon, just run over roughshod by most European and American claims. But Manifest Destiny is a definite American pastime, a big ideal of ours. Now, in our reading this week in Voices of Freedom, you're going to read the document on Manifest Destiny by O'Sullivan. And I would say to you this, it's a great one. It's one of the questions that we have this week. It sort of outlines a lot of these ideas that Americans have. Now, it is at part cringy. There are moments when you read it and you go, oh my God, did we say that? Yes, we did. And these are things that most Americans held to be true. So from the standpoint of a cultural superiority document, man, we feel pretty good about ourselves. You'll see a lot of that in the document that you read. Okay. Speaking of cultural superiority, we have arrived at a man who thought himself quite superior, James Knox Polk. Now, I know it looks like Polk, but from the hill country of Tennessee, where our man comes from, it would be pronounced more Polk. Now, this is, stay with me for a moment, this is the least known important president, I would argue. Polk is a one-term president. Right off the bat, you go, hard to do a lot in one term. But as far as achievements go, James Polk is the president that Americans should know more about that we don't know enough about. And really, that's because of the way he goes about his business. And I will explain that to you in a moment. Unfortunately, there are some habits, some practices that when we look at James Polk, there's a reason we don't put him on the currency or on the coins or on the stamps that much, because there's a part of us that goes, ooh, we don't like what you did, James Polk. We like what you did, but we don't like what you did. If you look at the picture of Polk here, I always find it important to point out that that is really a fabulous mullet that he is rocking there. And that collar, I don't know what that fashion statement is, but you keep rocking it there, James. Give you a great story. Polk is a political disciple of Andrew Jackson. And so early in his life, he sends a letter to Jackson where he, in essence, says to him, I'm a big fan. Could you find me a wife? That may seem like an odd request at the time, but what Polk's trying to say is, you carved out an excellent political career. Family was never quite your thing, General/President Jackson. I'd like to do the same thing. And Jackson writes him back and he's like, I got you. I got you this woman. Her name's Sarah Childress. You write to her. And Polk writes to Sarah Childress. And he basically lays it out. I want to be president of the United States. General Jackson said you'd make a great wife. What do you think? She said yes. They were married. They were married until he died. Polk is the shortest living American president after the term of the presidency. Now, I know you're saying, wait a second, some of the presidents died in office. Yeah, that doesn't count. But for people who actually made it out the door, he only lives about 100 days afterwards, physically exhausts himself in the task of the presidency. What does he do to physically exhaust himself? Let's get into it. Polk is known as a warmonger, and that's the reason we don't study him and we don't sort of put him up on that pedestal often enough. Some historians would say because of the practices. Here's what Polk will do for you. Polk's going to do what Americans want to happen, but they can't find the right person to go and make it happen. Americans want to expand into the western part of the North American continent. It's going to get bloody. It's going to take some very, very ugly, unfriendly foreign policy, and no one wants to put their political career on the line to do it, except for James Polk, who says, I'll do it. I'll do everything you ask me to do. You make me president. And then he does something very unusual. He says, I will do all of it, and I'll do it in one term. I will not run for a second term. My child is knocking on the door. Hello, he has a sugar cookie. Hello. In a world of quarantine, a sugar cookie is like, yeah, we are doing well. A visit from my son. I apologize for the brief distraction. But if you're Polk, you are willing to do what everyone wants to do. And as I said, you will do it in one term. Presidents don't normally sort of cap their own political careers, but Polk knows when the dust settles after he does what he does in 4 years, there is going to be a mess to clean up. He has no interest in cleaning it up. So that's what he's going to do. Let's get into the grit of it. Polk makes two promises, okay? One that essentially acknowledges the aspirations of people in the South. He says that I will annex, that is to say, bring into the country, the newly independent state of Texas. Now, more on the exact size of this Texas here in a moment, but in essence, that is a pledge to Southerners that I will go and get you more slave land. And then he makes a promise to Northerners that he will annex the territory of the Oregon area. Basically, if you look at the next map, it's slide number 27, he's talking about the territory that's purple there. Now, when he says it, he says 54-40 or fight. Now, let's go over to the next slide. I'm going to slide my way over there, if you would, and we'll come back to that first bullet point here. But what Polk says is this to the British, staying with my picture of the map. You will give us the northern border of the United States of America at the 54-40 parallel of latitude. That's what that line is at the top of the purple. You will give us that, or we will go to war against you. And that's the campaign pledge of the 1844 election. You can find buttons and all these, placards that said 54-40 or fight. That's a great slogan. It makes it wonderful t-shirts. Okay. Now, here's what Polk would say to you, though, after he gets elected. I don't intend to go to war over Oregon. We're going to negotiate a settlement there, but I do intend to go to war in other places. And let's be honest, we're not going to go to war in Oregon because that's a long way from anything we can supply. Britain is not going to go to war over Oregon. It's a long way from anything they can supply. So a territorial middle ground there is much easier for us both to acknowledge. So what do we get then, Holiday? We get the continuation of the treaty line established in the 18 teens by prior treaties. So that line that starts, if you start with me in the Great Lakes, all the way across Minnesota, the Dakotas, Montana, Idaho, Washington, the border that is the United States and Canada today. Polk establishes that. So that purple territory, that's new territory. James Polk, year one, Oregon Territory. Got it. Is it as big as it could have been? No, but I didn't go to war. I saved some money there because I have war in mind elsewhere. Now, back to that first bullet point. Polk is going to annex Texas. Now, the people of Texas want this to happen. They have been hoping that they can come into the United States. What's taken so long then? Well, the problem is that bringing Texas into the United States was controversial because it was a slave territory. And there was controversy or discussion, if you will, over the addition of such a large space of slave territory if there wasn't a free territory to balance it off. Now, when you look at this map here, and this is why I wanted you to have the map on hand, so let's have a close look. When you look at that map, Texas is kind of divided into two realities. There's the pure green Texas on the right, and then there is the hashed part, if you will, the cross-hashed portion on the left, okay? What's the difference? The difference is this. The United States of America, when it annexes Texas, believes that it has annexed both of those territories. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, he's getting into the weeds here, I don't know why, this matters. So let me clarify this for you as best I can. When the United States of America annexes Texas into the U.S., we believe that we are bringing in not just the eastern portion of Texas, that was the settled portion at the time. We believe we were bringing in the western portion that you can tell isn't quite the shape of Texas and has a weird little extension up into almost the heartland of the country there. That big territory as well. So if you said to the United States of America, United States of America, just how big is the state of Texas? The United States of America would point to that entire enlarged thing and say, that's it right there. Now, on the other hand, if you said to the independent Republic of Mexico, hey, how large is the Texas that's in the United States of America? They would say, just that green portion over on the right. That's Texas. And in their defense, that's where there were Texas settlers. The people who had fought at the Alamo and fought at Goliad and freed themselves from Mexico, that's where they lived. The territories in the West were more of a, we think we'll want those too. So there's a disputed territory between what Mexico says is the United States of America and what the United States of America says, no, that's Texas right there, and then Mexico's over on the other side of it. That boundary dispute is exploited by Polk. In 1846, Polk tries to buy the entire southwestern United States from Mexico. Okay, you can see it here. It's the territory that would include the kind of brownish area that's California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, all of that. Polk says to the people of Mexico, the government of Mexico, I beg your pardon, we'll buy that for $15 million. And the people of Mexico, in essence, say, no, we're not selling it. And they realize that it is an enormous territory, right? Keep in mind that at this point, Mexico is a country on the size of the United States. And today we might think of the U.S. as a much larger power in that sense, and power in a number of senses perhaps. But as far as real territorial land goes, Mexico is huge. And that's a big chunk of it, and they're not looking to sell. Polk is not put off by this. So Polk decides, here's what we'll do. We will build forts in the territory, and I'm pointing at my map here, so if you've got the map on hand, it helps. Polk says we're going to build forts in the territory between the green and the yellow in what is in essence the hashed green area, which is the disputed area. Polk is going to establish American forts there on the notion of saying Americans have set up forts there. Now, when Mexican patrols fire upon those forts, Polk can go to the floor of the U.S. Congress, as he does, and say American soldiers were shot and shed blood on American soil. We have to go to war. Now, there's great controversy over this. In fact, Abraham Lincoln leads this tremendous debate over the issue. And Lincoln, in essence, gets into this speech. It's a famous speech about a spot, where Lincoln, in essence, says, show me where this spot is. Where is this single spot of blood where Americans shed blood on American soil? Because everyone realized that the territory there was, at best, disputed. Shady might be another word for it. But when Americans are shot at, that brings about the war that Manifest Destiny wanted to take place. In other words, there was such a groundswell of support for war that once the conditions for it to happen took place, there wasn't much of a, well, maybe we shouldn't. There was a, oh yeah, we should. Now, the United States is going to pay the $15 million that we pledged initially to Mexico for the territory that is the Mexican cession, that huge chunk of the Southwest, okay, in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. There's a little bit left. You'll notice that darker red area there called the Gadsden Purchase in 1854. But otherwise, Americans would say, man, look at that. We have driven ourselves across the United States. This is a country that, let's put this into the right perspective here, is, depending on how you want to measure it, let's say you measure from 1776. Okay, 1776. 76 to 1800, that's 24 years. Take another 46, 46, 24. We're 70 years old. And in 70 years, we've managed to go from a set of colonies along the coast of the East here to having the entire run across. And there are plenty of Americans who would tell you, why stop there? For James Polk's purposes, I told you what I would do. I will go out, I will start wars, I'll do them in ways that might look a little dodgy, and in doing so, you might not like how it happens, but hey, here's your America, and now I am out. And Polk leaves the office of the presidency after one term, and it's wise of him to do so because things are about to get really interesting. Okay, on to our next slide. Let me grab a brief refresher here if I can. Now the ugly part starts. And this is what Polk knew was going to happen. So if you wondered why Polk got off the stage as quickly as he can, because Polk's a smart fellow, he knows that now you're going to have a fight over the territories. I look back at that territory or all that land we just picked up on slide number 27, and the question is, how much of that is free and how much of it is slave? Is it fair to assume that half of it is going to be free and half is going to be slave? As America becomes more wrapped up in its sectionalism, as you see a more strident defense of slavery in the South, as you see a more abolitionist tone emerging in the North, this question can only get thornier, okay? So one of the things you're going to see quickly come out of this is a pitch that is, in essence, none of it should be open to slavery, and that comes from a Pennsylvania congressman named David Wilmot. Wilmot says, in what's called the Wilmot Proviso, that all of the territories gained from Mexico, except for Texas, should be closed to slavery. Okay, what Wilmot is putting forward here is a principle that becomes known as free soilism in America, that the territory should be free soil. Now, I would love to tell you that David Wilmot is standing up against this because he hates slavery, and unfortunately I can't. David Wilmot is really here to make sure that there are territories in the far west for the future generation of Republican agrarianism. To put that another way, he loves farmers. He loves the idea of an America of small, independent farmers like Thomas Jefferson. And he's worried that if the territories of the far west, what is today California, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, if all of that becomes slave soil, then where will the next generation of small farmers go? There'll be nowhere for them to plant their farms. Now, you might sit there and go, wait a moment, Holiday, what about Oregon? Fair play. But Wilmot wants to make sure that none of that territory is open to anyone who has slaves. Now, let's think for a minute. Who's that going to upset? If you said, now play along with me, play along. I know you're sitting there listening to this. If you said we're going to close all of that territory to slavery, what section of the country is going to be the most upset? Say it. You said the South. Well done. Right? And rightly so. They should be mad. I'm not here to defend the slave-owning South, but think of it from a Southern perspective. Our young men fought in that war. Our taxes paid for that war. We have a right to expect that some of the spoils, and that's what the land is, it's spoils, some of the spoils of the war should be given to Southerners. So now you have Southerners who have dug in, a group we'll call fire eaters, who are going to say, we will not allow a single inch of soil to stay away from slavery unless it was already soil that wasn't a part of the slave system. In other words, in a moment, we're going to create the free state of California, but I need you to understand that that was never slave soil. So what the fire eater stance is, any territory that was kind of up for grabs has to remain at least up for grabs, or it has to be a territory that goes slavery. We're not letting you take anything that's middle ground and make it into free soil. Now what do? Because now you have two divided camps. You have this northern vision of America that is, we are going to have no slavery in certain portions. Then you have the southern vision of America that's like, we should have slavery everywhere. Whew, we need a compromise. And here we have one. The Compromise of 1850. Pull up the slide, if you would, ladies and gentlemen, so you can see the map. There's a lot going on in that map. So let's look there for a second. Hopefully it's showing up well enough. We've got yellow. I don't know why they picked these two colors. In fact, this map always, gets me a little bit, but I like it because it shows us clearly what we need to see, except the colors are whack, okay? In the blue, slave states, already existing states of slavery. In the yellow, territories that are closed to slavery, free states, including where it says unorganized territory. You see that right there? That is the territory of the Missouri Compromise. That's the Louisiana Purchase. You'll notice that below the yellow unorganized territory, there's a blue unorganized territory. That's the territory that has to be slave soil by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So really what I'm looking at this map thinking is, what's going to happen to California and what's going to happen to the brand new Utah and New Mexico territories? And the fate of those places is decided by a set of political compromises called the Compromise of 1850. I call it a set because that's what it is. It has become so hard to pass legislation in the United States when the word slavery is involved. It is impossible to do in one big package. They had to break this thing into smaller bite-sized pieces and have it voted on individually. That was the only way this sucker was getting through. And even then, it took a lot of political maneuvering and promises and what we would call pork. I will give you this roads project if you vote favorably on my bill over here. Okay, so a lot of that has to happen. Let's look at it as four parts. Number one, California enters the United States as a free state. California had never been a state of African American slavery. Had there been Native American slavery? Absolutely, under the Spanish, that's true. But under Mexico, slavery was abolished. There was no slavery there then. And as a result of that, this is a territory that was pretty much a free territory and then a free state. We should add to it that the discovery of gold in the late 1840s makes for plenty of workers. In other words, California is a hot place to go. You don't need to import labor from anywhere. Everyone who can get to California thinks, if I get to California, I will become rich as fill in the blank, right? I'm going to find all the gold I need to find. So that is a free state. Victory, if you want to go with victories this way, for the northern part of society. They just picked up a big free state that balances that new slave state of Texas there. Okay, so you can be like, there's one. Okay, there we go. Number two, this is probably the hardest one to take in. So let's make sure we understand. Slave status of the Utah and New Mexico territories decided by popular sovereignty. Okay, popular sovereignty. The will of the people who settle the region. This is the greatest act of cowardice and brilliance in the same moment you've ever come across. Let me describe why. What you're saying is, these are territories where not very many people live at this point. Why get into a national fight right now over whether or not they're going to be slave or free states? Just wait for the people who settle them to become territories and they can decide. So here's how this works. Once 5,000 eligible age males live in the territory, they can vote free or slave. Okay, I said a moment ago that it was brilliant and it's also cowardice. I've just described why it's brilliant. It makes good sense as a system. It's an act of cowardice because they should try and settle this issue. They should get this off the agenda one time, but they won't, right? We saw this at the Constitutional Convention, in all fairness, right? They had a lot of compromises there themselves. So this compromise is another set of, okay, let's put it off to another day. In doing this, when you look at this map, and I'm asking you to do a little bit of mental coloring for a moment. If I'm the territories of the North in the yellow, the free states, if I yellow in the orange, I can look at an America and say, that's predominantly free. slavery is a sectional institution. It really lives in the southeastern pocket of the United States. I'm good with that, okay? If, on the other hand, I'm the blue states of the South, and I think to myself, if I could take those orange territories and shade them in blue, it's about half. We would be happy with that, right? So both sides are pleased with the settlement here. Now, if you know the topography, the geography, the vegetation, you're looking at the map going, what could you grow there, right? That's like Nevada, Utah, Western Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico. You're going to grow cactus or tarantulas? What are you going to grow? So, in all fairness, it doesn't look like a territory that should be open to the idea of plantation agriculture and slavery as a result of it. But Southerners are convinced that that might be the case. And so we will see where the future takes us there. Okay? But in a sense, then, you could argue that this is a victory for both sides. Number 3, a stricter fugitive slave clause. This takes a little explaining as well. There was, in the original Constitution, a portion, that said if a fugitive slave was captured, that the person who captured the fugitive slave was supposed to return that slave to the South. Southerners thought that Northerners were a little lax on this, that as a part of their growing abolitionist sentiment, they turned a blind eye to escaped slaves. And they're right about this. There are states and there are regions where you are more likely to see people who are enslaved escaping, and there was a growing feeling of resentment towards slavery, and people did turn a blind eye. Right? I'll tell you from personal experience. I've been to Louisville, Kentucky. Right? Louisville, Kentucky sits right across the Ohio River from Indiana. And the river is wide there. I don't know exactly how wide it is, but by eyesight, I'd put it at 3/4 of a mile. But if you could get from the slave soil of Louisville, Kentucky to the free soil of Indiana, you were a free person. The people of Louisville, though, were upset at the people of Indiana because they feel like the people of Indiana should be waiting, watching, and saying, oh, you're definitely an escaped slave, and I'm going to return you in the sense that you and I today might be expected to return a wallet, a lost phone, a valuable item of possession, because that's how Southerners viewed a person. The stricter fugitive slave clause is a Southern victory in this compromise because it says that Northerners are supposed to do more of the catching and more of the returning of slaves. Now let's take another walk in another direction here for a second. The word nullification has come around a couple of times for us, that idea of states overriding federal laws. And it's going to come up again here because there are going to be states, Wisconsin's a great example of it, who look at the fugitive slave clause and go, not here. No, I'm not doing that because I will not have you turn me into a slave trader. I understand that we're Americans. I understand that I'm supposed to follow the laws, but I'm not going to take this federal law that forces me into a moral moment of compromise and allow you to have your slave back. I refuse, okay? And Southerners realize that, and they're going to be upset about it. So, ongoing debate there. Lastly, the abolition of the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Not slavery itself, but the trade of slaves. All right? So be clear about that. In the territory that is Washington, D.C., you could not trade slaves. This doesn't eradicate slavery from the District of Columbia. Keep in mind, there's Southerners who'd be like, you're not taking slavery out of any soil where it exists. Forget that, okay? But Northerners can say at least, in the nation's capital, you can't trade slaves. Small victory. But it is a victory nonetheless for those forces in America who felt as though this was a growing thing of abolitionism, okay? So the Compromise of 1850, victories for the North, victories for the South, but most importantly, if you lived through that period, you would go, we're done. We know what every inch of American soil is going to be in terms of slavery or freedom, except for the 2 popular sovereignty territories, and we'll let the people who settle those sort those out, and the problem of America is over. We're finished. We don't have to worry about anything. Next week, we'll talk about how all of that was completely wrong. Okay, here's the questions one more time, ladies and gentlemen. Let me turn this around, unplug my phone there. There's our questions right there. Again, I hope you're well. If there's anything I can do to help you, please reach out. Take care of yourselves out there, folks.